The sitting resumed. It's time for questions to the Minister of Justice. Question 3 has been withdrawn. The Rishin, Iram Sir Cara Hunter, Lation Cage Case to I called Cara Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Question 1, please, Minister.
I would first of all like to take the opportunity to condemn the military invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the untold horrors being faced by the people of Ukraine. I'm aware of statements from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees advising that over 2 million refugees have now fled Ukraine. This is indeed a humanitarian crisis. To date, there is no evidence of human trafficking or exploitation in Northern Ireland as a result of the Ukraine crisis. The PSNI is liaising with Home Office immigration enforcement officials and An Garda Síochána, and while there will be refugees who may enter Northern Ireland, none of these have sought to enter the national referral mechanism to date. Criminals seek to exploit any issue where they see a benefit to them. They do not care about people or their rights. They seek only to line their own pockets. Given that we know this, there is a real risk that criminals and organised crime gangs will seek to take advantage of the vulnerability of those fleeing the conflict. We will do all we can to assess and monitor the risk and ensure we are working collectively with our partners on the Organised Crime Task Force and the Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking Subgroup to ensure that we are alert to the risks and to seek to prevent any further exploitation and pursue offenders.
Cash Brescia, Cara Hunter. Supplementary question for Cara Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for such a detailed answer on what is such a heartbreaking subject. And the Minister will be aware that the conflict in Ukraine has touched really the hearts and minds of people right across the north. And I have to say, I find it exceptionally cruel and callous, the lack of support from the British Government for these vulnerable people at this time, and the devastation that they have experienced is truly unimaginable. Therefore, Minister, can I just ask you, just off the back of that, can you please detail any further collaboration that you have had with your counterparts in the Republic of Ireland, please?
Well, in terms of our engagement, it has, as I say, been through the PSNI and An Garda Síochána, in terms of ensuring that people who decide to come to Northern Ireland through the Republic of Ireland are safe to do so. Immigration, as the member will be aware, is a reserved matter, and the current policy on immigration, I think, has a significant impact on individuals and their families in terms of their feelings of self-worth and dignity and their inability to provide for their families while they're seeking refuge here. I do believe that the efforts that have been made by government fall well short of what we would all have wanted to see. Whilst I welcome the ability to be able to register our homes online if we're willing to receive refugees into our homes for a period, the inability for us to be able, even as an executive, to be a super sponsor in this case that would allow us to match refugees with homes, I think is a barrier to us being able to provide the kind of care that the people of Northern Ireland would wish to do. So it's telling that 6,000 people have registered their homes, and yet there is no official reception scheme here in Northern Ireland that would allow us to make use of that.
Minister, the former director of Anti-Slavery International last week warned that the scheme to house Ukrainian refugees increases the risk of human trafficking, and the light touch safeguarding checks can't offer the comprehensive security that vulnerable refugees, the majority of whom, let's remind ourselves, are women and children, need. So what role will the Department of Justice have in ensuring that sponsors are thoroughly vetted, and how will the Minister ensure that sufficient protections against trafficking are in place?
Well, there are a number of issues that we will take up, and I'll try to answer from that question. First and foremost, in terms of safeguarding concerns, the vulnerability of those seeking refuge is fully recognised, and the need to ensure all necessary safeguarding arrangements are in place. It's also important to ensure that sponsors under the Homes for Ukraine scheme are safe and protected. Officials within Access NI are assisting the multi-agency strategic planning group to ensure that the necessary checks are in place. As part of the operational planning, consideration is being given to what Access NI checks might be required and also options for checking the suitability of accommodation. It is important that sponsors are willing to cooperate with any checks where required, as they are in the interests of everyone's safety. There will also be a need for ongoing support for both sponsors and those being sponsored to ensure the arrangements are working and continue to work throughout the period of the sponsorship period, particularly where people's circumstances may change. I understand the consideration of the type of support and how best it can be provided is being considered by the multi-agency strategic planning group. I think it goes without saying, of course, that there are particular vulnerabilities where, for example, you have unaccompanied children and minors arriving. However, that seems to be a problem that has mostly been resolved in the countries immediately adjacent to Ukraine. And I know that Romania and other authorities have been dealing with large numbers of unaccompanied minors. I think the majority of those arriving in the UK, including via routes from the south, have been arriving in family groups to date, but the numbers are small because, as you're aware, the visa requirements are still quite stringent and provide a significant barrier to people being able to come forward.
I call Doug Beattie.
I thank the Minister. I mean, this is a really important issue, and we've discussed this already. But going back onto that people trafficking, where we can understand why everybody is focused on Ukrainian families coming in from that terrible situation, but we also know we have many asylum seekers here already in Northern Ireland. Could I ask the Minister what work has been done to ensure that those who cannot work or supplement their income aren't themselves being trafficked, who are actually in hotels and other temporary locations around Northern Ireland?
Well, I thank the member for his question, and it is something that I think has concerned me now for some time, and I raised it indeed on the last visit of the Commissioner for Human Trafficking. I've also raised it with the UK Government, and indeed I took the lead, and we agreed that a five-party letter from the five-party leaders would go to the Home Office Minister to make clear our desire that all refugees would be treated fairly and the same. We recognise there is an emerging humanitarian crisis specific to Ukraine, but there are many other refugees in need of accommodation, and we need to ensure that they too are treated fairly. But also that we recognise the danger of not allowing people to work while they wait for refugee status. We know that the process can take sometimes 5 and 6 years for people to actually receive their status finally after application. And that is a long time for people to have to live on a subsistence allowance, which doesn't allow them to properly prepare their children and their families and to care for their children and families, but also doesn't allow them to properly build a life and have some dignity in terms of being able to care for themselves and their families at a time when they have been stripped of dignity through having to leave their homes in tragic circumstances. This is an issue which my own department has also raised with the Home Office. Ultimately, I think that the hostile environment policies, including the ban on work for those seeking asylum, risk further marginalising vulnerable people and leaving them at risk of exploitation through modern slavery or trafficking, whether that is to Northern Ireland, through Northern Ireland or within Northern Ireland.
I call Paula Bradshaw.
Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your answers so far. And just to put on record my thanks and recognition to you for over 2 years of question time. I'm sure you'll be relieved that this is your last one today. They've been quite gruelling. Minister, just to pick up on the point around the issue of the joint letter from the 5 political parties and the lack of an executive, and I'm just wondering if you could give your assessment of how easy it's going to be to facilitate Ukrainian families coming to reside here, make a home here without an executive after the next election. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there are issues that we still can proceed with. So the Executive Office officials are continuing to liaise directly with their counterparts in Westminster in terms of ensuring that Northern Ireland gets the right levels of support, both financial and technical support, in terms of being able to support refugees who come to Northern Ireland. But the major gap from not having an executive is that we are unable to directly influence the number of refugees. So unlike the case in Afghanistan, where there were a set number of refugees that would be taken by the UK and then distributed across the UK, that is not the scheme that we have in place. Each person has to get here under their own steam, have to meet their own visa requirements, and then have to find and partner with a family. In the case of Wales and Scotland, they have opted to become a super sponsor, where they can sponsor a significant number of individuals to come, and they can undertake the matching process with families to ensure that those who don't already have connections into the Ukrainian community are still able to offer assistance where possible. That option is not available to us because we don't have an executive to be able to take that kind of decision. But we have made clear from the 5 party leaders that we would welcome efforts to try and assist people in finding accommodation in Northern Ireland, and that we want to play our full role. The other challenge, of course, will be around funding, because We will need to know how many people have arrived, and we will need to be able to track that, because the funding that's being offered through Westminster is being offered to local government, who provide most of the services in the UK. There is additional funding being provided. However, most of those services are provided here by central government agencies, and therefore it would be important that we know how many people are here, because it will be a per capita amount in terms of the additional funding rather than a Barnett consequential. So there are a number of challenges, I think, and not having an executive in place, I think, exacerbates those.
Sir Anya Murphy, I call Anya Murphy.
Question 2, please.
Section 27 of the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, Northern Ireland 2021, was commenced last month, enabling regulations to be brought forward to provide for domestic abuse protection notices and orders. With the introduction of the new offence completed, the establishment of these notices and orders is now a priority work area for my officials. Preparatory work has begun on considering the framework for the draft regulations, as well as a guidance document for practitioners, which will map out the process for the notices and orders and explain how they work in practice. My officials have recently joined a working group led by the Home Office and Ministry of Justice in order to learn from their experiences and to help inform policy development and operational preparations for Northern Ireland. In taking work in this area forward, 2 pilots will be established to robustly test the model ahead of a rollout across Northern Ireland. Discussions are ongoing with the criminal justice system partners to consider geographical locations for the 2 pilots. It's envisaged the proposed locations will shortly be brought to a multi-agency task and finish group for agreement.
Anya Murphy, supplementary question for Anya Murphy.
And thank you, Minister, for your answer. Minister, would you agree with me that Fermanagh may be a suitable rural area for the launch of the Domestic Abuse Protection Notices and Orders pilot, given the many difficulties that are faced by women from rural areas in terms of accessing support services for domestic abuse?
Well, I wouldn't want to prejudge the outcome of the consultations around this, and indeed the decisions of the Task and Finish group. But I do think it's important that when we choose pilot areas, we choose those which reflect both urban and rural realities, that we look at areas that have particular issues around domestic abuse and indeed access to support services. And so I think that all of that ought to be considered by the Task and Finish group when it comes to deciding where those pilots will be. Because what we need to do is provide a system that is as robust as possible in every part of Northern Ireland, so that people are protected when they are subjected to domestic abuse, and that these orders and notices are able to be used effectively irrespective of the location.
Call Rosemary Barton.
Minister, thank you for your answers so far. Minister, you spoke about the 2 pilots that you're hoping to introduce. Can you give us a bit more detail on what they will entail?
Well, it will be 2 geographical areas where we will trial the rollout of domestic abuse protection notices and domestic abuse protection orders to test, first of all, how they can be used by local police. So there will be specific training for the police in those circumstances, and also working with those who work in the domestic abuse field to ensure that they're fully aware of them. Once we have trialled those, we will be able to see where any difficulties have arisen, whether that be in access to courts, whether that be in access to police resources, or whether it is in referral pathways. And when we have concluded those particular trials, we will then be able to make any fine-tuning that is required before rolling out the project right across Northern Ireland.
Question 3, or sorry, question 4.
As you'll be aware, I have been very clear in calling out and recognising the need to tackle misogyny, including in public life. This, as well as addressing violence against women and girls more widely, is an important issue that we all have an interest in. The new laws that I'm bringing forward will protect those at most risk of violence, which too often is women and girls. These include a Protection from Stalking Bill and a Justice Sexual Offences and Trafficking Victims Bill. And taken together with the new domestic abuse offence, these 3 pieces of legislation represent a step change in support for vulnerable women and girls in Northern Ireland, though not exclusively for vulnerable women and girls. There are also a number of consultations underway at the moment which are seeking views in relation to the issue of violence against women and girls in all its form, domestic and sexual abuse, and also misogyny as a hate crime. I will want to take account of the views expressed in these consultations before reaching any final decisions on how best to deal with this matter. It's also important to remember that legislative change alone will not tackle the underlying issues of entitlement, misogyny and violence. The issue is broader than justice and requires societal and cultural change from the roots up, tackling the root causes of aggressive behaviours at an early stage through preventative initiatives, education and relationship awareness. We need to tackle underlying issues of entitlement to focus on dealing with unacceptable behaviour.
Sinead Ennis, supplementary question for Sinead Ennis.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Minister, you'll be aware of the recent Scottish Government report which proposes new misogyny-specific legislation with offences to tackle misogynistic harassment, incitement of hatred against women and threatening to rape or assault women. Would this be some of the new offences that you would be looking at in including any future proposed hate crime bill?
Well, as the member will be aware, we are at the first consultation stage in terms of the hate crime bill for Northern Ireland, which we will hope will be able to be brought forward in the next mandate. That is based on Judge Marinen's report. And there were two options essentially available to us. One was to include gender as a specific characteristic within the hate crime legislation that would be added to those characteristics to which hate crime would apply. The second was to specifically add misogyny as one of the issues, and we need to have, I think, further consultation, but we are doing the call for views on that now. There are pros and cons, I think, of both approaches. Whilst misogyny has the benefit of putting a name to the particular issue, and I think also highlights the prevalence of the issue, there are wider issues with respect to gender that might also lead to hate crime, and so we need to consider which is the most appropriate way forward. Before the second consultation, which would be on a draft bill, that will of course have been decided either by myself or a future minister in terms of shaping the legislation, and the Assembly and indeed the public will be consulted before any changes are made in that regard. We will of course take, as we always do, any progress that's been made in other jurisdictions into account as we draft any new bill.
I call John Blair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for the updates and the insight from a justice point of view on this issue of misogyny, and further to that, linking with the obvious related issue of violence against women and girls. Can I ask the Minister, given work commenced by the Department of Justice and work commenced also that I'm aware of as a policing board member by the PSNI, does the Minister share my concern that access to legislative process could be seriously hindered by the absence of a working executive, and this could cause a serious hindrance, therefore, to progress on the issue of tackling violence against women and girls?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of non-legislative measures, in terms of tackling culture and attitudes, we can of course continue to make progress in that regard, and it is important, I think, that all of us show leadership in respect of those issues. But when it comes to providing legislation, when it comes to providing legislative protection, and in particular when it comes to updating our very out-of-date hate crime laws in Northern Ireland, it will require us to have a functioning executive and a functioning assembly to do that. We have passed 5 bills in the Department of Justice in this mandate, and the Assembly has worked very hard with me and with the Department in that regard to ensure that we were able to make significant changes, which I do think represent a step change in the protection available to particularly vulnerable victims and witnesses. However, we will not be able to do so without an executive and an assembly, and so it is imperative, given the amount of work that I can see in the future for the Justice Department and indeed any future Justice Committee, that there is no lag in terms of reforming an executive and moving forward with these kind of very important proposals.
Mayor Justin McNulty Leicester. I call Justin McNulty.
Does the Minister agree with me that the member, having brought this topic to this House, should put on record an apology for her vile, misogynistic and misandristic tweets and recognise her role in promoting toxic discourse?
Wow. I don't think that that's a question, Mr Deputy Speaker, for me. I think that is a private exchange that perhaps the member should take up with the member who raised the question, rather than politicking and expecting me to be involved in it during question time.
I call Pádraig Glargy.
Question number 5.
Justice Agency currently funds specific child and adolescent mental health services, CAMS, in relation to the Woodlands Juvenile Justice Centre and also in the community on a pilot basis through co-funded arrangements with the Southern and Western Health and Social Care Trusts. While there is a statutory obligation on the Youth Justice Service to provide healthcare services, including mental health care, in the Juvenile Justice Centre, the provision of mental health services in the community is the statutory responsibility of the Department of Health. To meet an unmet need identified for young people known to the Youth Justice Agency in the community, the agency has developed a pilot CAM service in conjunction with both the Southern and Western Trusts. Due to the identified need and the success of this CAMS pilot, it would have been our wish to extend these services to the other 3 youth justice areas, Belfast, Eastern and Northern. Although the budget has not been agreed, given the proposed reductions in the draft budget for the next 3 years, coupled with the additional pressures of also managing significant inflationary pressures, the Youth Justice Agency would not be in a position to roll out the CAMS pilot as originally hoped, while still maintaining the services which it has a statutory duty to provide. I will, of course, review this position once the budget is agreed.
Cash Brescia, Pádraig Glargy, supplementary question for Pádraig Glargy.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. And children in the justice system face unique difficulties in accessing mental health support, despite mental health problems being higher in this population group. However, where the Youth Justice Agency has funded these services, it's produced better outcomes. And given that, would the Minister give a costed feasibility for a full rollout of these services?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we recognise that the gaps exist, and rather than sit back and wait for others to fill them, the Department of Justice, as so often is the case, stepped into that gap. And he is correct, the member is also correct in saying the pilots have proven to be very effective, engaging hard-to-reach children, both within the justice system and also those on the fringes of it, in terms of improving their mental health. The number of young people engaging fully with those services has increased significantly, from 14% in mainstream CAMS provided solely by trusts to 88% through the pilots. So it has been a hugely significant change in terms of engagement with young people that have serious mental health issues. My officials have been working for ways to find and maintain those pilots and, if at all possible, develop similar services for other parts of Northern Ireland. Under the current draft 3-year budget, this will be difficult to achieve from within the DOJ budget, but I'm open to working with the Minister of Health and indeed with the Minister of Education and others to find ways that we can co-fund projects of this nature and ensure that we deliver the kind of benefits that we have seen this project deliver to a much, much wider group of young people.
Iramir Cahalboyle and the Cash Dakar.
Cash Everett Shea, Led Hall, question number 6, please.
I think it's vitally important that the independent scrutiny of criminal justice system has continued during the pandemic, despite the challenges that has presented to inspection teams. I welcome the report recently published by the Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice following an unannounced inspection of Magilligan Prison during May and June 2021. The Magilligan report recognised and commended the efforts of the leadership team and staff in response to COVID-19, acknowledging that while other jurisdictions lock their prisoners up, we continue to deliver healthy out-of-cell regimes for people in our care. The report also correctly recognises that the pandemic constrained some of the very valuable work that is normally delivered at Magilligan, particularly in respect of purposeful activity. Prison Service is clear in its determination to recover and refocus on supporting and challenging prisoners to rehabilitate and resettle back into the community. Balancing recovery against the risks that COVID will continue to be present is at the forefront of the daily work being led by the Director-General. The Magilligan report identified significant areas of innovative good practice and, like every report, it contains learning and recommendations that will help drive improvement. The Governor and his team are working to address the findings currently.
Cash Brescia, Cathal Boylan, supplementary question for Cathal Boylan.
Agus going breakish lesson as up the Fragra. Could I thank the Minister for the answers? Minister, the recent criminal injustice or justice inspection report identified the use of illegal drugs and diverted prescription medication in prison as a key area of concern. So my question would be, when will body scanners be introduced in prisons in the north to prevent the smuggling of drugs, and can she introduce any other measures to prevent this as well?
During the inspection, Mr Deputy Speaker, 150 prisoner surveys were completed. 46 individuals indicated that they had developed drug problems since their arrival in custody, which is of course of concern. The same survey highlights half of the respondents said they had a drug problem before arriving at the establishment. Drug testing during this period showed that the majority of failures, 98%, were for illicit use of prescription medication rather than those drugs that have been trafficked into the prison. Magilling is committed to disrupting supply, reducing demand and promoting the principles of recovery for people in custody, and that work will include action to address recommendations made by Misogyny in their inspection report. We also have to work very closely with the South Eastern Health and Care Trust and other key partners in terms both of limiting access to other medication, but also the diversion of prescription medication to people who ought not to have access to them, and that will require us to work closely together. There is a huge amount of work that goes on within the prisons in order to prevent illicit drugs coming in, but of course body scanners would add to the options available for us to prevent that from happening. We would hope that body scanners will be made available and that we have a business case already in process for that. However, everything is budget dependent, and unfortunately the Department of Justice draft budget would not allow for us to do that as quickly as I would have liked.
I call Mervyn Storey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for her answers thus far. The report also identified, and the Minister made reference to it, areas of innovative work that had resulted in particular good practice, which included the care driven by the prisoner safety and support team, the work of the family support officers and partners to sustain and promote family contact. Will the Minister take this opportunity as our final day at the question and answers in this House to thank our prison staff and all associated in our prisons who do an extremely difficult and challenging job, and thank them, despite what has happened in regards to the pay offer, for the work that they do, and wish them well as far as trying to prevent the drugs that are coming in, sadly, to our prisons.
It would be my pleasure, Mr Deputy Speaker, to do so. I have found some of the people who work in our prisons to be some of the most innovative and creative people that I have come across in the justice system. Their job is not easy. It is a challenging and often dangerous environment and can be incredibly volatile. Yet every day they go to work, they look after prisoners in their care, they do so with dignity and respect, and they ensure that those prisoners have access both to contact with their families safely, but also to contact with those who can help them with their rehabilitation and their medical and spiritual needs. Being a prison officer is not an easy job, but it is a worthwhile one, and it does add to the safety of our local communities. And I want to pay tribute to all of those who work within the prison service for the work that they do. I have seen people during my time as Justice Minister who have left prison service and rehabilitated and re-entered the local community and not re-offended. And that is a tribute to those who worked with them diligently and tirelessly throughout their time in prison in order to help them rebuild their lives. It is such an important piece of work because by rehabilitating people properly and ensuring rehabilitation, we ensure that there are fewer victims, but we also ensure that those who have been previously involved in crime can actually build a better future for themselves and their families. For me, it is one of the most worthwhile things that anybody could do as a career.
Éireann Sir Cara Hunter, le ceiste I call Cara Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her answers so far. Does the Minister agree with me that we need to do all we can to improve opportunities for prisoners to experience more face-to-face learning, which is vital for future prospects as they re-enter society? Thank you.
Absolutely, and the work that we're doing within the prison service is to ensure that when people now leave prison, they do so with recognised formal qualifications so that they're able to enter the job market on a par with other people and are able to compete for jobs in a much fairer way. And I think that that has been enhanced hugely by our cooperation with further education colleges in terms of delivery and lectures. That has been disrupted by COVID, undoubtedly so, but I'm glad to see that the prisons are now more open, that people are able to come into the prison to provide education and support. And hopefully we will see that extend, but we will also have the benefit of now having virtual systems in place so that some things that were previously off limits to prisoners and that they couldn't study will now be available to them in a virtual setting. And I think that the combination of the two will enhance greatly the education offer that we have available.
I can see here, Sir Emma Sheeran for you cash Gasta. I call Emma Sheeran for a quick question.
Cash very shortly, the whole question 7, please.
I'm pleased to confirm that I met with the Education Minister earlier this morning when we discussed plans to improve the standard of relationship and sexuality education in our schools. I'm encouraged to hear how her department plans to take forward a number of steps to improve RSE provision, including improving the resources available to teachers and supporting them in the delivery of RSE, working with and funding the Council for Curriculum Examinations and Assessment to develop the RSE progression framework to provide structured guidance for schools to use in the teaching of RSE, issuing a departmental circular encouraging schools to incorporate subjects such as violence against women and girls and consent into lesson plans, and identifying underperformance in RSE delivery using Education and Training Inspectorate inspections, followed by support and resource interventions to help schools improve. I remain disappointed that the Education Minister has concluded that a review of the minimum content order on RSE is not needed. I believe that that is the best way in order to ensure that there is consistency of RSE education across the piece. However, I welcome the steps for improvement she has set out. My department will continue to work with the Department of Education and other partners to implement the Gillen Review and ensure that the provision of RSE fully meets the requirements of all our children and young people.
That ends the period for listed questions. We'll now move to the topical questions. I can see Sir Matthew Toole. I call Matthew Toole.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your answers today. Minister, as of last Thursday, more than 6,000 people in Northern Ireland had registered an interest in hosting a Ukrainian refugee based on a UK-wide number of 140,000. That is more than 3 times our population share, a remarkable testament to the generosity of people here. But can you confirm that as of right now, there is no agreed executive position on how refugees will be managed once they get here? And isn't that a completely unacceptable position for the very generous people of Northern Ireland to be placed in by this executive?
Well, there is a 5-party agreement in terms of the fact that we do want to offer safe refuge to people from Ukraine. And as I said in answer to an earlier question, I took the lead on behalf of the 5 leaders, the 5-party leaders, of writing to the Home Office and making that clear on behalf of all 5 parties in the executive. And I hope that that has not fallen on deaf ears. However, it is true to say that without an executive present, it is difficult for us to, for example, take action as has been taken by Scotland and Wales, where they were able to become super sponsors and actually do the work of matching families with refugees. So many of the families who have registered their homes, myself included, may well find that they do not have the resource to be able to connect with a family who might be wanting that accommodation. So it is a challenging situation, and of course having an executive there would make things simpler. In the interim, however, I continue to work with officials in the Executive Office and with the Head of Civil Service to do as much as we can to try to deliver the generosity which the people of Northern Ireland have offered.
Kesh Breshig, Matthew Toole, supplementary question for Matthew Toole.
Thank you, Minister, for that update. We've just learned from Irish Government ministers in the last hour that more than 10,000 Ukrainian refugees are already on the island of Ireland. Is the Minister alive to the risk that, given some of the lurid comments around the soft border on the island of Ireland that we all treasure, or most of us do, that there is a risk from Priti Patel's Home Office that there could be a move towards trying to impose some kind of hard borders, as it were, in terms of Ukrainian refugees who are here, given what we know, some of the challenges that people of colour face on both sides of the border, frankly, in this island, in terms of immigration rules and officials. Is she alive to that, and will she engage with the Home Office to ensure that that doesn't happen?
I can assure the member that I already have, because already we do have people in Northern Ireland who arrive through the Republic of Ireland and travel north, and it's important that those who do so are able to access the same resource and support as anyone else arriving through any other means. Through the Refugee and Asylum Seeker Strategic Planning Group led by the Executive Office, discussions have been ongoing between the UK Government and the devolved administrations to ensure support is provided. I welcome the recent announcement of the schemes that will apply in the UK, but I have expressed my concern that I think the Government could go further in terms of supporting families to find the connections with those who have offered them accommodation. We do recognise and have raised with the Home Office that not everyone who enters Northern Ireland will arrive through an official UK route. And I understand the PSNI is also liaising with the Home Office, who lead on immigration, to assess options to accommodate where this might occur. I would be extremely concerned were anyone to apply, if you like, the hostile environment policy in a negative way when it comes to people who have fled Ukraine, find themselves on this island and travel north. perhaps to be closer to family, and find themselves essentially being moved on because of our immigration policy falling short.
Sir Gemma Dolan, Fania Cash, I call Gemma Dolan.
Minister, can you provide an outline of any primary legislation your officials are drafting for introduction in the next mandate?
Yes, I can. There are a number of pieces of legislation. First of all, there is a miscellaneous provisions bill, which members will recall had to be carved out of the sexual offences and human trafficking bill in order for it to make its passage through the executive. So the remaining requirements of that bill will be brought forward in the next mandate. We're also working on a hate crime bill, and we have been, as you know, undertaking public consultation in that regard. There is also the potential, which we're working through at the moment, for a children's law bill, which again I think would be something that would be very welcome. And as I say, there are a number of other options which are currently under consideration, some of which will be able to be picked up, I think, as part of the miscellaneous provisions bill early in the mandate, others that may require slightly slower time in terms of being able to develop them. And finally, though by no means least, as you're aware, the consultation on Charlotte's Law, which was undertaken earlier in this mandate, has now completed, and it would be our intention, obviously, to legislate in that regard as well.
Cash Brescia, Gemma Dolan, supplementary question for Gemma.
Minister, there was a lot of essential legislation passed in this mandate, and I want to commend you as Minister and this Assembly for delivering these progressive and far-reaching changes. I'm sure you'll agree with me that there's still much work to be done to ensure our justice system has the confidence of the public, particularly in relation to sentencing. How far advanced is the sentencing review work, and how soon could it potentially be introduced?
Well, the member has done well to remind me of yet another piece of work that's underway in the department, because she is, of course, correct that having undertaken a sentencing review and consultation, we have now been working over the last 6 to 9 months on the sentencing bill itself, and it would be our intention, hopefully, to bring that forward in the first 18 months of the next mandate.
Next year, Sir Colm Gilden, Cash to Car, I call Colm Gilden.
Gormagat, Lascan Corlia, and Gormagat Minister. Minister, could you set out for us the level of resources that will be required in terms of both staff and funding to carry out a scoping review on a pilot mental health court?
I wouldn't have the figures on those two issues at hand today, but I would be happy to write to the member before the Assembly rises in order to provide him with those figures. I have to say that it is something that I think is hugely important. As you know, we're already well involved in pilots around problem-solving justice, of which mental health and indeed drug addiction are two of key components. I think the reality is that these are not cheap interventions. They are expensive and costly. In Scotland, it is often the Department of Health who provide the therapeutic element to those courts, and Justice that provides the justice element. Here we have generally, as the Department of Justice, filled the gap by engaging third sector partners to provide the therapeutic element. But I think going forward it would be better were the two departments to work more closely together, and perhaps that would provide the resources required for us to be able to adequately deal with those issues.
Brescia, Colm Gilden, supplementary question for Colm Gilden.
Gormagat, and I welcome your reference to your acknowledgement of the importance of establishing such a court. Can you give us any indication in terms of timeline as to when we might see progress on this important issue?
Given the uncertainty in the budget and indeed the uncertainty of the next mandate, it would be difficult to give a timeline on this. Needless to say, the Department is very keen to continue to make progress where possible, but I think the financial constraints are likely to impact heavily, particularly on problem-solving justice, because, as I say, it is resource intensive, though I would argue in terms of the overall picture, in terms of the long line of cost, it is probably one of the best interventions we can make.
I call Rosemary Barton.
Thank you. Minister, can you confirm that the number of custody accommodation suites throughout Northern Ireland police stations has significantly reduced over the past 10 years?
The issue of custody accommodation in police suites in police stations is not a matter over which I have any purview. It is a matter for the Chief Constable and for his officers, and it would be a matter for the Policing Board. So I would suggest the member would redirect her question to the Policing Board and the Chief Constable in the first instance.
Supplementary question for Rosemary Barton.
Minister, it's been brought to my attention that Oma Custody Suite it's a very modern police station and a modern suite, and it's going to be refurbished. Can you make comment on that?
No.
call Andrew Muir.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I start by welcoming the appointment of Geraldine Hanna as the Victims of Crime Commissioner Designate. Can I ask the Minister for an update on when she will take up her role and establish her office?
Well, I thank the member for raising this issue, and of course I'm delighted that we have someone who is so committed to victims' issues and so knowledgeable about victims' issues, willing to take up the post of Victims of Crime Commissioner Designate. I think that Geraldine Hanna will be a real asset to this office. We have already put in place the mechanisms for her office to be established, and when she comes to us, hopefully within the next month or so, we will be in a position to start and hit the ground running. As Commissioner Designate, it will be partly her job to describe the extent of the office, the kind of priorities the office should have and how it should run, as well as engaging directly with victims during their time. And I think there is no person better placed to do so, given her experience as in her time in Victim Support NI.
I call Andrew Muir.
Thank the Minister for her response and her work in relation to this and all her work throughout the last 2 years as Justice Minister. Can the Minister give us a flavour of what the implications would be if we do not establish an executive following the forthcoming election? What impact would that have upon your ministry and the actions you want to take forward?
Well, specifically with regard to the Victims Commissioner, it would require, it would not be possible to put the office on a statutory footing as had been intended. That was always the intention that we would do so, but it was likely to take a longer period of time. Of course, as with everything else, all of the legislation that I mentioned in relation to the previous question would also be held up because it has to go through the Executive first for policy approval before it reaches the floor of the House. So I think it is fair to say that there would be much that we could do by way of current maintenance, but not much we could make by the way of progress.
Question 6 has been withdrawn. I call Doug Beattie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Minister, can I just ask you, were the independent pay review body recommendations considered when making the recent pay offer to the Northern Ireland Prison Service?
Sorry, Minister, that somebody's mobile phone is very close proximity to a mic. And it's interfering with the recording system.
I noticed, Mr Deputy Speaker. The pay award for prison grade staff, as I set out this morning, has been negotiated with Prison Service and with the Prison Officers Association over recent weeks and months. The intent was that we would be able to not only deal with pay, but also deal with the number of points on the pay scale, because there are a lot of points in the pay scale, and obviously we would like to contract those to a more reasonable and rational length. That would have advantaged those in the prison service who are on the lowest paid salaries. The pay award which we offered was then, after negotiation with PGA and POA, was then offered a counter proposal from the POA. And in discussions and with my approval, prison management agreed to that counter proposal, which was put to membership through a ballot. On Friday, the POA area chairman advised the Director General that the membership had rejected the pay proposals. I'm disappointed at that outcome because I believe it was a missed opportunity. In practice, that meant the Director General has therefore had to impose a pay settlement for 2021-22 and wrote to staff yesterday outlining what that would mean for different categories of officer. The alternative was we did nothing but the absolute minimum, with over 1 million secured for pay rises being lost, and that for me would be unthinkable, particularly at a time when many of our officers will be struggling financially. Having said that, because the settlement is being imposed, there are a number of things that cannot be done, including the proposal put forward by the POA, and regrettably the funding set aside to do those things will now have to be surrendered. Work continues to progress the grading review, which is ongoing and nearing completion, and we will also then be passing on the pay remit for 2022-23 to the PRRB for next year's pay round. As I say, it was, for me, a missed opportunity, and I think it is fair to say it will be difficult to recover the lost time that we have achieved over this year.
Supplementary question for Doug Beattie.
Thank you, and thank you for that. That comprehensive answer, Minister. But I'm not sure I got to the nub of the question I asked, and that was the pay review body recommendations used in relation to that settlement? And I'm getting the understanding is that the activation letter for the pay review body was not sent. Therefore, there was no recommendation. And is that not part of the contract, that they do not go on strike because the pay review body helps deal with disputes in regards to pay?
I can certainly confirm whether or not the pay review body was invited to begin work on this in writing to the member. However, I am aware that the pay review body is normally tasked with doing that work. Indeed, the pay review body is invited to begin work on the next pay round. We have, however, been asked specifically to consider by the pay review body issues around the review of the grading review. And that's what we have been focused on. Indeed, we were engaged directly with the Prison Officers Association, and it was their recommendations, which we accepted, that were rejected.
Thank you, members. That time is now up, and if members just take their ease while we move to the next item of business, please.